Ronaldo heard strange sounds while training at Al Nassr Stadium. The screams coming from the depths of the tunnels drove him to investigate. What he found revealed the dark past of the stadium. The horrifying secrets hidden beneath Al Nassr Stadium are revealed in this video. What was in the secret tunnels that Ronaldo discovered, and what was this stadium really used for? Stay tuned to learn the end of this mysterious story, because the truth is much darker than the stadium. The Al Nassr Stadium felt different during late-evening training sessions. Without the roar of 25,000 fans, the massive concrete structure seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, a slow, heavy pulse that Cristiano Ronaldo had grown accustomed to over his months in Riyadh. At 41, he cherished these quiet moments when he could work on his technique without the constant scrutiny of cameras and crowds, pushing his aging body through drills that had become as natural as breathing. Tonight was no different, or so he thought. The floodlights cast long shadows across the pristine pitch as Ronaldo worked through his usual routine: sprint intervals, ball control exercises, and precision shooting drills. The stadium staff had gone home hours ago, leaving only the skeleton crew of security guards who mostly stayed in their booth near the main entrance. This isolation was exactly what Ronaldo preferred. It allowed him to focus purely on the craft that had defined his life for over 2 decades. The first sound came during his 15th free kick practice. A low rumble, barely audible above the hum of the stadium's ventilation system. Ronaldo paused, ball at his feet, listening carefully. The noise seemed to emanate from somewhere deep beneath the field, like distant thunder trapped underground. He shrugged it off initially. Old stadiums made strange noises, especially concrete structures built quickly in desert climates where temperature fluctuations could cause expansion and contraction. But as he continued his training, the sounds became more frequent and more distinct. What had started as vague rumbling evolved into something that made his skin crawl. Between the 30-minute mark and 45 minutes of his session, Ronaldo began to hear what could only be described as voices. Not the distant chatter of security guards or maintenance workers, but something altogether more unsettling: muffled cries that seemed to echo up through the very foundations of the stadium. The veteran footballer had experienced many strange things during his career. He'd played in stadiums with unusual acoustics, dealt with crowd noise that could disorient even experienced players, and encountered facilities with quirky architectural features that created unexpected sounds. But this was different. These weren't echoes of external noise or tricks of acoustics. They sounded like human voices in distress, calling out from somewhere far below the playing surface. Ronaldo's curiosity got the better of his caution. He'd always been someone who confronted challenges head-on, whether they were opposing defenders or career obstacles. The mysterious sounds represented a puzzle that his competitive nature wouldn't allow him to ignore. After collecting his training gear, he decided to explore the stadium's lower levels, areas he'd never had reason to visit during his time with Al Nassr. The player tunnels were familiar territory. He'd walked through them countless times before matches, feeling the pre-game energy and anticipation. But tonight, in the empty stadium, they felt different. The fluorescent lighting hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to shift and dance as he moved. The concrete walls, painted in Al Nassr's signature blue and yellow, looked almost institutional in the stark artificial light. Beyond the standard player facilities lay a maze of corridors that served the stadium's operational needs. Storage rooms filled with maintenance equipment, electrical panels that controlled various systems, and narrow passages that allowed staff to move between different levels without being seen by spectators. Ronaldo had never explored these areas before. They were the domain of engineers, custodians, and technical staff who kept the massive facility functioning. As he descended deeper into the stadium's infrastructure, the sounds became clearer and more disturbing. What he was hearing weren't random noises or mechanical sounds. They were unmistakably human voices, and they carried tones of fear and desperation. The acoustics of the concrete structure seemed to channel these sounds upward, like some terrible message being transmitted from the depths. The deepest level he could access through normal corridors brought him to a utility area filled with massive pipes, electrical conduits, and mechanical systems. The air here was warmer and more humid, carrying strange odors that reminded him of old hospitals or abandoned buildings. But even at this depth, Ronaldo could tell the voices were coming from somewhere even lower, beyond the reach of the stadium's official infrastructure. His investigation of the utility area revealed something that shouldn't have existed, according to any stadium blueprint. Behind a large electrical panel, partially concealed by a cluster of pipes, was a narrow opening in the concrete wall. It wasn't a doorway exactly, more like a gap that had been deliberately created and then camouflaged. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and from within came the unmistakable sound of moving air, suggesting it led to a larger space beyond. Ronaldo's athletic build served him well as he maneuvered through the opening. On the other side, he found himself in a rough-hewn tunnel that definitely wasn't part of the stadium's original construction. The walls were carved from the natural rock beneath Riyadh, reinforced with concrete in some places but largely left in their raw state. This wasn't modern construction. It had the feel of something much older, possibly predating the stadium by decades or even centuries. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, lit by a series of bare bulbs that had been strung along the ceiling. Someone had been maintaining this space, keeping it accessible and functional. The voices he'd been hearing were louder now, echoing off the tunnel walls with a clarity that made his blood run cold. They weren't random sounds or his imagination. People were definitely somewhere ahead, and they sounded like they were in serious distress. As he moved deeper into the tunnel system, Ronaldo began to notice details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The walls bore marks that looked like they'd been made by tools, not modern excavation equipment, but hand tools like pickaxes and shovels. Scratch marks in the stone suggested desperate clawing, as if people had tried to dig their way out. Most unsettling were the dark stains on the floor and walls that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The tunnel branched into multiple passages, creating a network that extended far beyond what should have been possible given the stadium's footprint. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this underground maze, and they'd done it without any apparent oversight or official documentation. The construction quality varied wildly. Some sections were professionally reinforced and well lit, while others were crude excavations that looked barely stable. Ronaldo chose the passage where the voices seemed loudest, following the sound deeper into the underground complex. The air grew thicker and more oppressive as he descended, carrying smells that reminded him of decay and human suffering. His phone had lost signal completely, and he was beginning to question the wisdom of this solo exploration. But the voices were becoming more distinct, and he could now make out what sounded like pleas for help in multiple languages. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber, and what Ronaldo found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The space had been converted into a series of crude cells, each one barely large enough for a person to lie down. Most were empty, but a few still contained occupants, emaciated figures in tattered clothing who looked up at him with a mixture of hope and terror. These weren't stadium workers or authorized personnel. They were prisoners, held in conditions that belonged in humanity's darkest historical chapters. The smell of human waste and unwashed bodies was overwhelming, and the visible injuries on some of the captives suggested they'd been subjected to physical abuse. Some appeared to be foreign workers, others looked like they might have been local dissidents or political prisoners. But perhaps most shocking was the evidence that this wasn't a recent development. The cell construction showed signs of long-term use, with improvements and modifications that suggested years of operation. Whoever was running this underground prison had been using the stadium as cover for their activities, possibly since the facility's construction. The perfect hiding place, beneath one of Saudi Arabia's most public and celebrated venues. Ronaldo's discovery raised terrifying questions about how such an operation could exist without detection. Stadium construction projects involved multiple contractors, government inspections, and ongoing maintenance that should have revealed any unauthorized excavation. The only explanation was that people in positions of significant authority were either complicit in or directly responsible for creating this hidden prison. As he tried to process what he was seeing, Ronaldo heard new sounds from deeper in the tunnel system, footsteps and voices that definitely weren't coming from the imprisoned victims. Someone was approaching, and given the nature of what he'd discovered, they probably wouldn't be pleased to find an unauthorized visitor. The football superstar realized he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than stadium acoustics or architectural curiosities. The prisoners seemed to recognize the approaching sounds as well. Those who were conscious began showing signs of panic, trying to retreat further into their cells or curl up as if preparing for punishment. Their reactions suggested that whoever was coming represented a source of fear and pain in their daily existence. Ronaldo faced a choice that would define not just his remaining time at Al Nassr, but potentially the rest of his life. He could retreat now, escape through the tunnel system, and try to pretend he'd never seen what lay beneath the stadium. Or he could stay, document what he'd found, and accept the enormous personal risk that came with exposing such a massive human rights violation. The approaching footsteps were getting closer, and time was running out for him to make that decision. The footsteps Ronaldo heard weren't those of casual maintenance workers or security guards making routine rounds. They moved with purpose and coordination, suggesting multiple people who knew these tunnels well and were comfortable navigating them in the dim lighting. Worse, he could hear the metallic sounds of equipment being carried, tools or weapons that rattled softly against belt buckles and clothing. Ronaldo pressed himself against the rough stone wall of the chamber, trying to become invisible while his mind raced through limited options. The tunnel he'd used to enter offered the only obvious escape route, but the approaching sounds were coming from that direction. The chamber itself offered little concealment, just the narrow spaces between the makeshift cells and some scattered debris that wouldn't hide a man of his size. The prisoners had fallen completely silent, a behavior that spoke volumes about their learned responses to these approaching sounds. Even those who had seemed barely conscious moments before were now perfectly still, as if any movement might attract unwanted attention. Their terror was palpable, filling the underground space with a tension that made breathing difficult. When the first figure appeared in the tunnel entrance, Ronaldo got his first clear look at the people responsible for this nightmare. The man wore civilian clothes, khakis, and a polo shirt that wouldn't look out of place in any Riyadh office building, but he carried himself with military bearing. More importantly, he wore a security badge that Ronaldo recognized as belonging to Al Nassr's official stadium operations team. This wasn't some external criminal organization using the stadium as cover. The prison was being operated by people with legitimate access to the facility, people who could move freely through official channels without arousing suspicion. Stadium security badges would allow them to work at all hours, bring in equipment and supplies, and access areas that would be off-limits to others. The man was followed by two others, similarly dressed and equipped. They carried what appeared to be medical supplies and food containers, suggesting this was a routine maintenance visit to check on the prisoners and ensure they remained alive and manageable. The casual efficiency with which they moved spoke of a well-established system that had been operating for considerable time. Ronaldo watched in horrified fascination as the three men went about their tasks with bureaucratic routine. They checked each cell systematically, making notes on clipboards, administering what looked like medications or sedatives to some prisoners, and replacing water containers. It was the banality of evil made manifest, atrocities carried out with the same attention to detail one might apply to stadium maintenance. From his hiding spot, Ronaldo could observe enough to understand the scope of what he was witnessing. This wasn't a hastily constructed temporary holding facility, it was a sophisticated operation designed for long-term prisoner management. The men knew exactly which prisoners needed what type of attention, suggesting detailed record-keeping and ongoing medical monitoring. Most disturbing was how the prisoners responded to their captors. There was no resistance, no attempts to communicate or plead for release. They had been broken so thoroughly that they simply accepted whatever was done to them with passive compliance. This level of psychological conditioning doesn't happen overnight. It requires sustained effort over months or years. One of the captors spoke quietly into a radio device, reporting status updates in Arabic. While Ronaldo's command of the language was limited, he caught enough words to understand they were communicating with supervisors elsewhere in the facility. This operation had multiple levels of management and coordination, making it clear that what he'd discovered was just one component of a larger system. As the men worked their way through the cells, Ronaldo realized with growing dread that they would inevitably discover his presence. The chamber wasn't large enough to hide indefinitely, and their systematic approach would bring them to his location within minutes. He needed either an escape plan or a story that might convince them he was an innocent intruder who could be trusted to keep quiet. But before he could decide on a course of action, one of the prisoners made a decision that changed everything. A woman in the cell closest to Ronaldo's hiding spot suddenly looked directly at him, and in a clear voice that cut through the underground silence, called out in English, "Help us please, tell the world what they're doing here." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. All three captors spun toward the sound, immediately spotting Ronaldo's position. The woman had sacrificed any hope of avoiding punishment to ensure that at least one person in the outside world would know about their situation. Her courage in that moment was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The lead captor, a man in his 40s with the bearing of a former military officer, approached Ronaldo with calm confidence. He showed no surprise or alarm at finding a famous footballer in their underground prison, just the mild irritation of someone whose routine had been disrupted by an administrative problem that needed to be resolved. This reaction was perhaps more terrifying than anger or panic would have been. It suggested that discovering unauthorized visitors was a scenario they'd encountered before and had established procedures for handling. Ronaldo wasn't the first person to stumble across their operation, and their calm suggested they were confident in their ability to manage the situation. The man gestured for Ronaldo to stand and move away from the wall, speaking in accented but fluent English. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, as he explained that Ronaldo had wandered into a restricted area of the stadium and would need to come with them to sort out the security breach. No threats, no obvious weapons displayed, just professional courtesy from someone who clearly held all the advantages. But Ronaldo had spent enough time around dangerous people during his career, fans who'd crossed the line from enthusiasm to obsession, business associates with questionable backgrounds, politicians whose smiles masked ruthless calculation. He recognized the signs of someone who was comfortable with violence and had the power to act on it without consequences. The woman who had called out was already being punished for her outburst. One of the other captors was preparing what looked like a sedative injection, while another fitted her with restraints that appeared far more sophisticated than anything needed to control a malnourished prisoner. These people had extensive experience in managing human beings as livestock. As they escorted him through the tunnel system, Ronaldo tried to memorize every detail of the route and the facility's layout. If he survived this encounter, he would need to provide investigators with precise information about locations, access points, and the scope of the operation. The tunnel network was more extensive than he'd initially realized, with multiple branches leading to different chambers and what appeared to be storage areas. They passed rooms that served various functions in the underground complex. One appeared to be a medical facility equipped with examination tables and monitors that wouldn't look out of place in a modern hospital. Another contained communication equipment and banks of monitors showing feeds from security cameras throughout the stadium and possibly other locations. Most shocking was a chamber that appeared to be living quarters for the staff operating this facility. It was comfortably appointed with furniture, recreational equipment, and personal belongings that suggested people spent extended periods down here. This wasn't a part-time operation run by contractors who came and went. It was a full-time facility with resident staff. The scale of the infrastructure investment was staggering. Someone had spent millions of dollars creating this underground complex, equipping it with advanced technology, and staffing it with skilled personnel. This wasn't the work of a small criminal organization or even a single government agency. It required the resources and coordination of a major institutional power. Their destination was an office space carved from the rock and fitted with modern furnishings that created a surreal contrast with the crude tunnel construction. Behind a desk that wouldn't look out of place in any corporate environment sat a man who Ronaldo recognized from Al Nassr's organizational charts, a senior facility manager who'd been introduced to the team during their initial stadium orientation. This recognition was perhaps the most disturbing revelation yet. The person responsible for this underground prison wasn't some shadowy criminal or foreign operative. He was an official employee of the football club, someone with legitimate authority over stadium operations. This meant the organization that employed Ronaldo was either complicit in or directly responsible for the atrocities being committed beneath their facility. The manager greeted Ronaldo with the same professional courtesy he'd shown during their previous interactions, as if discovering the team captain in an underground prison was merely an unusual administrative matter that needed to be resolved through proper channels. He offered tea, inquired about Ronaldo's training session, and generally maintained the fiction that this was a normal business meeting. But underneath the surface pleasantries, a negotiation was taking place. The manager was clearly assessing Ronaldo's value as a potential ally versus the risk he posed as a witness to their operations. Famous footballers had certain protections that ordinary prisoners didn't enjoy. Their disappearance would attract international attention and potentially expose the entire operation. The conversation that followed would determine not just Ronaldo's fate, but potentially the future of everyone imprisoned in the tunnels beneath Al Nassr Stadium. The manager was offering him a choice between complicity and consequences, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The tea was excellent, which somehow made the entire situation more surreal. Ronaldo sat in the comfortable office chair, sipping from delicate china while surrounded by evidence of systematic human rights violations that would have shocked international observers. The facility manager, who introduced himself simply as Mr. Khalil, maintained his professional demeanor throughout their conversation, as if discussing prisoner management was no different from coordinating stadium maintenance schedules. Khalil's approach was sophisticated and psychologically calculated. Rather than relying on threats or intimidation, he chose to treat Ronaldo as an intelligent businessman who could appreciate the complexities of managing a large-scale operation. He spoke about the underground facility as if it were a legitimate government program, using bureaucratic language that sanitized the horror of what was actually happening. According to Khalil's explanation, the tunnels housed individuals who posed various security risks to Saudi Arabia's stability and modernization efforts. Foreign workers who had violated their employment contracts, political dissidents whose activities threatened public order, and criminals whose standard imprisonment would be complicated by diplomatic considerations. The facility provided a solution that kept these problematic individuals safely contained while avoiding the complications of formal legal proceedings. The presentation was masterful in its cynicism. Khalil acknowledged that the facility's existence wasn't publicly known, but framed this secrecy as necessary for national security rather than as evidence of criminal activity. He spoke about international law and human rights as abstract concepts that had to be balanced against practical realities of governing a rapidly changing nation. But beneath the diplomatic language, Khalil's real message was clear. Ronaldo had seen something he wasn't meant to see, and they needed to reach an accommodation that protected everyone's interests. The football superstar's fame and international connections made him too valuable to simply eliminate, but also too dangerous to release without ensuring his cooperation. The offer Khalil presented was both generous and terrifying. Ronaldo could continue his career with Al Nassr without interference, and certain considerations would be made to enhance his compensation and extend his contract terms. In exchange, he would need to maintain complete silence about what he'd discovered and occasionally provide assistance with activities that required his unique access to international football networks. The assistance Khalil described sounded relatively innocuous, helping facilitate meetings between Saudi officials and their counterparts in other countries, providing introductions to influential people in global sports, occasionally carrying diplomatic communications that needed to avoid official channels. But Ronaldo understood that accepting any part of this arrangement would make him complicit in the underground operation and vulnerable to escalating demands for cooperation. To emphasize the seriousness of their situation, Khalil provided details about the facility's history and scope that were clearly intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The underground complex had been under construction for nearly a decade, integrated into the stadium's development from the earliest planning stages. Multiple government agencies were involved in its operation, and it was just one node in a network of similar facilities throughout the region. Most chilling was Khalil's casual mention of other high-profile individuals who had discovered the operation and chosen cooperation over confrontation. He didn't provide names, but implied that several international celebrities, politicians, and business leaders were aware of facilities like this one and had reached similar accommodations with their operators. Ronaldo wouldn't be unique in choosing pragmatic silence over dangerous idealism. The psychological pressure was immense, but Ronaldo's competitive instincts kicked in as he processed the situation. Throughout his career, he'd faced moments where the odds seemed impossible, penalty kicks that could decide championships, matches where his team was overwhelmed by superior opponents, career challenges that threatened to end his professional journey. In each case, he'd found ways to perform under pressure by focusing on controllable factors and refusing to accept defeat. While Khalil continued his presentation, Ronaldo was mentally cataloging everything he'd observed during his time in the facility. The tunnel layouts, the security procedures, the number of prisoners, the equipment and technology being used, all information that would be crucial for any future investigation. He was also assessing potential leverage points and vulnerabilities in the operation that might be exploited if he chose resistance over cooperation. The facility's greatest strength, its integration with stadium operations, was also potentially its greatest weakness. Any serious investigation would inevitably involve Al Nassr's ownership and management structure, potentially exposing connections between the football club and government agencies that preferred to remain hidden. The international nature of professional football also meant that any scandal involving the team would attract global media attention. Khalil seemed to recognize that Ronaldo wasn't simply accepting his explanation because the tone of the conversation began to shift subtly. The diplomatic language gave way to more direct descriptions of what happened to people who chose not to cooperate with their operations. He mentioned previous incidents where individuals had attempted to expose similar facilities, describing their fates with the detached professionalism of someone discussing business metrics. But even these implied threats carried a subtext that Ronaldo found encouraging. If the operations managers felt the need to negotiate with him rather than simply eliminating him, it meant they recognized significant risks associated with his disappearance or death. His fame provided a form of protection, but only as long as he remained visible and active in the public eye. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another staff member who whispered something urgent in Khalil's ear. The facility manager's expression tightened slightly, the first crack in his professional composure since their meeting began. Whatever news had just been delivered was clearly unwelcome and required immediate attention. Khalil excused himself briefly, leaving Ronaldo alone in the office under the watch of one of the security personnel. This gave him the opportunity to observe details that might prove crucial later. The office contained computer equipment that was clearly connected to external networks, suggesting that the facility's operations were coordinated with other locations. Maps on the walls showed the broader tunnel system extending far beyond what he'd already seen. Most importantly, he noticed security monitors displaying feeds from various parts of the stadium complex. The underground facility was clearly integrated with the venue's overall security system, which meant their activities were being recorded and archived. If those recordings could be accessed by outside investigators, they would provide irrefutable evidence of the facility's existence and operations. When Khalil returned, his demeanor had changed noticeably. The diplomatic facade was slipping, replaced by the urgency of someone dealing with an evolving crisis. He informed Ronaldo that their conversation would need to be concluded quickly, as there were operational matters requiring immediate attention. The implied pressure was clear: make a decision now, because the window for negotiation was closing. But rather than rushing into an agreement, Ronaldo asked for time to consider the proposal. He pointed out that such a significant decision required careful thought, and that hasty choices often led to regrettable outcomes for everyone involved. This request seemed to surprise Khalil, who had apparently expected either immediate acceptance or outright refusal. The facility manager agreed to a brief delay, but made it clear that Ronaldo would need to remain in the facility until his decision was finalized. This wasn't exactly imprisonment, but it wasn't freedom either. He was escorted to comfortable quarters that had been prepared for important visitors, a stark contrast to the cells housing the facility's involuntary residents. Alone in the visitor quarters, Ronaldo began planning for what might be his only opportunity to expose the underground operation. His phone remained without signal, but he noticed that the room's ventilation system connected to the broader tunnel network. If he could access the facility's communication equipment or reach the surface long enough to send messages, he might be able to alert outside authorities to the situation. But he also understood that any attempt to escape or communicate with the outside world would likely result in his joining the other prisoners in those underground cells. The people operating this facility had demonstrated their willingness to detain high-profile individuals when necessary, and his fame wouldn't protect him indefinitely if they decided he posed an unacceptable risk. The choice before him was stark: accept complicity in ongoing human rights violations in exchange for personal safety and career preservation, or risk everything to expose a system that was almost certainly too well connected and well protected to be easily dismantled. It was the kind of moral test that would define not just his remaining years as a footballer, but his entire legacy as a human being. As night fell over Riyadh, somewhere far above the underground facility, Al Nassr Stadium sat empty and silent. But beneath its foundation, in tunnels that officially didn't exist, one of the world's most famous athletes was about to make a decision that would determine whether the screams echoing through those concrete corridors would ever be heard by the outside world. The weight of truth had never felt heavier, and the price of justice had never been more personal. In the darkness of the underground facility, Ronaldo prepared to discover what mattered more: the preservation of his carefully constructed life, or the lives of people whose names he didn't even know but whose freedom had become his responsibility. The final whistle of his career was approaching, but this wasn't a game where the score would be reset for the next match. This was real life, where some defeats lasted forever, and some victories came at costs that could never be fully calculated until it was too late to change course.